The moment everything changed. A man stands in a concrete corridor, facing an overwhelming challenge that could define his entire existence behind bars. Everyone thought Marcus Chen would become just another victim in the brutal hierarchy of Oak Ridge Correctional Facility. But what happened when this quiet newcomer decided to respond differently? Get ready for a story that will inspire you to discover the profound power of disciplined restraint and inner transformation. If you're ready to witness how true strength reveals itself in the most unexpected moments, stay with this journey and consider subscribing for stories that challenge conventional thinking about courage and resilience. Marcus Chen had been incarcerated at Oak Ridge for exactly 14 days when Derek "Tank" Morrison decided to make an example of him. The cafeteria fell into its familiar pattern of strategic silence, that peculiar quiet that descends when violence becomes inevitable. Inmates positioned themselves carefully, some turning away to avoid witnessing what came next, others subtly angling for better views while maintaining plausible deniability. Tank weighed approximately 260 pounds of institutional rage, accumulated over 8 years of territorial dominance. His reputation had been carefully constructed through calculated brutality and strategic intimidation. Marcus, by contrast, appeared unremarkable at first observation. Average height, lean build, movements characterized by economical precision rather than aggressive posturing. The collision occurred near the serving line. Tank's shoulder check carried the full weight of intentional provocation, designed to establish hierarchical positioning through physical confrontation. Marcus stumbled backward, his tray clattering against the metal counter, but remaining balanced through reflexive adjustment. "Watch where you're walking, fresh meat," Tank announced, his voice calibrated to carry across the cafeteria without seeming theatrical. This wasn't personal anger, it was institutional performance, the maintenance of carefully cultivated dominance. Marcus straightened slowly, his expression remaining neutral. His eyes met Tank's directly, without challenge or submission, simply acknowledgement of another human presence. This response violated the expected script inmates typically demonstrated either immediate aggression or clear submission. Marcus's calm observation suggested a third category that Tank's institutional experience hadn't encountered. "My apology," Marcus replied quietly, his tone carrying neither sarcasm nor fear. He began gathering his tray with unhurried movements, each gesture demonstrating complete environmental awareness without appearing defensive. Tank's hand shot forward, gripping Marcus's collar with practiced intimidation. The cafeteria's ambient noise dropped further. Several guards positioned along the perimeter shifted their attention toward the developing confrontation while maintaining their strategic distance. Interventions occurred only when absolutely necessary. What happened next would fundamentally alter Oak Ridge's social architecture. As Tank pulled Marcus closer, preparing to deliver the psychological dominance that preceded physical violence, Marcus's body remained completely relaxed. No tension, no resistance, no fear-driven adrenaline flooding his system with reactive aggression. "You don't want this," Marcus said softly, his words reaching only Tank's ears. Tank hesitated, momentarily disoriented by this unprecedented response. The observer's advantage. Behind every moment of violence lies a choice that determines whether strength manifests through destruction or transformation. What Tank Morrison couldn't comprehend in that suspended instant would soon become painfully clear. What happens when someone responds to aggression not with submission or counterattack, but with complete psychological presence? This chapter reveals the hidden dynamics that separate reactive violence from disciplined power. Insights that transform how we understand conflict itself. Tank's confusion manifested in microsecond calculations visible only to those trained in observing human behavior under pressure. His grip on Marcus's collar tightened reflexively, a physical punctuation to reassert dominance when psychological certainty wavered. Around them, the cafeteria maintained its collective holding pattern, witnesses suspended between expectation and curiosity. Marcus's breathing remained steady, his pulse controlled through years of practiced regulation. He didn't pull away from Tank's grip or lean into confrontation. Instead, he maintained perfect neutral positioning, his body language communicating neither threat nor capitulation. "Everyone's watching," Marcus observed quietly, his tone conversational rather than warning. "You establish dominance by making me afraid, but what happens if I'm simply not afraid? Tank's eyes narrowed. Inmates didn't philosophize during confrontations. They fought, submitted, or occasionally attempted desperate negotiation. This analytical calm violated every pattern Tank had internalized through countless similar encounters. Behind Tank's considerable bulk, movement rippled through the cafeteria's social geography. Carlos Rodriguez, a lifer with extensive institutional influence, shifted his attention fully toward the developing situation. Carlos possessed the rare combination of physical capability and strategic intelligence that granted him authority transcending simple violence. His interest in this exchange carried weight that other inmates immediately registered. "You think talking makes you tough?" Tank demanded, his volume increasing slightly to reassure watching inmates that he maintained control of the interaction. "I think violence is easy," Marcus replied evenly. "Discipline is difficult." The statement hung between them, its simplicity containing layers that Tank's anger couldn't immediately parse. His free hand clenched into a fist, muscle memory preparing for the physical release that would restore familiar dynamics. Then Tank noticed Carlos watching intently. The lifer's expression revealed nothing, but his focused attention introduced unexpected complexity. Carlos rarely involved himself in routine dominance displays, his power secure enough to require minimal maintenance. His observation suggested this situation contained elements worth noting. Tank released Marcus's collar with a slight push, creating physical separation while maintaining the appearance of dismissal rather than retreat. "Watch yourself, Chen. This ain't over." Marcus nodded slightly, gathering his tray without hurry. "I understand." As Tank moved away, several inmates reassessed their initial evaluations of the new arrival. The absence of violence felt somehow more significant than its occurrence would have been. Marcus carried his tray toward an empty corner table, his movements unhurried, completely aware of the attention tracking his progress. Carlos continued watching, his expression thoughtful. 30 years of incarceration had taught him to recognize unusual patterns. Marcus Chen demonstrated something beyond simple courage or foolish fearlessness. The new inmate's complete lack of reactive aggression suggested training, discipline, and perhaps experience that Oak Ridge's typical population didn't possess. The cafeteria's ambient noise gradually resumed its normal levels. Guards relaxed slightly, grateful that intervention hadn't become necessary. Tank rejoined his usual associates, accepting their reassurances that he'd handled the situation appropriately. But perception had shifted subtly, invisibly, in ways that would compound through subsequent interactions. Foundations of stillness. True mastery reveals itself not through aggressive demonstration, but through calm presence under pressure. Marcus Chen's response to Tank Morrison's confrontation raised questions throughout Oak Ridge's social networks. Who was this quiet newcomer who responded to violence with philosophical observation? What training created such profound self-control? Understanding Marcus's foundation requires exploring how discipline transforms fear into presence, a lesson applicable far beyond prison walls. Marcus sat alone at his chosen corner table, methodically consuming his cafeteria meal with focused attention. His isolation appeared voluntary rather than imposed, an important distinction within institutional social dynamics. Inmates who sat alone due to rejection occupied a different status hierarchy than those who chose solitude from self-sufficiency. Across the cafeteria, Tank's associates processed the confrontation through their established interpretive frameworks. Leon Stretch Williams, Tank's primary lieutenant, leaned close to offer analysis. "New fish is either stupid brave or actually crazy," Stretch observed. "Nobody talks to you like that without backup." Tank nodded slowly, his ego requiring validation that he'd maintained appropriate dominance. Yet uncertainty lingered beneath his surface confidence. Marcus's complete absence of fear suggested either profound foolishness or capabilities that Tank hadn't encountered. "We watch him," Tank decided. "See who he connects with, what he's about. Then we handle it properly." Meanwhile, Carlos Rodriguez approached Marcus's table with deliberate casualness. Other inmates noted the movement immediately. Carlos didn't approach anyone without purpose. He stopped near Marcus's table, waiting for acknowledgement rather than demanding it. Marcus looked up, his expression open but neutral. "Join me?" Carlos sat without responding, his presence conferring a degree of protection that Marcus likely didn't fully comprehend yet. For several minutes, they ate in companionable silence. Carlos appreciated that Marcus didn't fill the quiet with nervous conversation or deferential questions. "You military?" Carlos finally asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Marine Corps. 12 years. 3 deployments." Carlos nodded. The information explained some patterns: the disciplined movement, the environmental awareness, the absence of reactive fear. But military service alone didn't fully account for Marcus's profound psychological control. "Before that?" Carlos prompted. "Studied traditional martial arts from childhood," Marcus replied. "My grandfather emphasized internal cultivation over external technique. Control of self before control of circumstances." This background provided crucial context. Carlos had observed many combat veterans navigate prison life. Some adapted well. Others struggled with institutional authority after military service. Marcus demonstrated neither aggressive dominance nor submission to hierarchy. A third path requiring substantial self-knowledge. "What brought you here?" Carlos asked, his tone neutral, recognizing this question might touch sensitive territory. Marcus met his gaze directly. "Manslaughter. Defended my sister during a home invasion. The man I stopped didn't survive. Courts determined I used excessive force." The explanation carried no self-justification, no anger toward the legal system, no claim of victimization. Carlos recognized the emotional work required to achieve such equanimity regarding profound injustice. "How long?" 8 years, eligible for parole in 5 with good behavior. Carlos absorbed this information, already calculating how Marcus's presence might affect Oak Ridge's delicate social equilibrium. The new inmate possessed capabilities that could either stabilize or destabilize existing power structures, depending on how various factions responded to his presence. "Tank will test you again," Carlos observed. "His reputation requires it." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand. What would you recommend?" The question demonstrated wisdom, seeking guidance from established authority, rather than assuming his military and martial experience automatically translated to institutional competence. "Don't humiliate him," Carlos advised. "Don't submit to him. Find the narrow path between those extremes." "The way of water," Marcus replied quietly. Carlos smiled slightly, recognizing the philosophical reference. "Exactly. Strategic patience. Power in confined spaces operates through complex calculations that transcend simple physical dominance. How do individuals navigate environments where violence remains constant possibility while maintaining personal dignity? What strategies preserve self-respect without escalating conflict into inevitable confrontation? This chapter explores the sophisticated social intelligence required to transform potential enemies into uncertain observers, wisdom applicable to any challenging environment. The afternoon recreation period brought Oak Ridge's population into the yard, where sunshine offered temporary reprieve from institutional confinement. Inmates segregated themselves according to established social clusters, racial affiliations, gang connections, shared interests, or simple compatibility. Guards maintained perimeter observation, their presence symbolic rather than preventative regarding most interactions. Marcus walked the yard's outer track alone, maintaining steady pace and environmental awareness. His solitude continued attracting attention. Most new inmates sought protection through group affiliation immediately upon arrival. Marcus's independence suggested either dangerous naivety or confidence rooted in capability. Tank observed from his usual position near the wait stations, surrounded by associates who reinforced his status through collective presence. The morning's cafeteria encounter required response, but Tank found himself uncertain about appropriate escalation. Marcus's philosophical calm had introduced strategic complexity into what should have been straightforward dominance establishment. "You want us to handle the new guy?" Stretch asked, his tone suggesting eagerness for delegated violence. Tank considered this option carefully. Directing associates to assault Marcus would maintain his dominant position while avoiding direct confrontation with the unpredictable newcomer. However, it might also appear weak, using proxies to address personal challenges. "Not yet," Tank decided. Let's see how he handles general population dynamics first. Across the yard, 3 inmates affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood approached Marcus with calculated aggression. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man called Razor, positioned himself to block Marcus's path along the track. "This section's restricted," Razor announced, his tone carrying rehearsed menace. "You want to walk here, you need permission." Marcus stopped naturally, creating appropriate distance while remaining relaxed. Guards noticed the developing interaction but didn't intervene. Territorial positioning fell within acceptable institutional dynamics, unless violence became explicit. "I apologize for the intrusion," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm unfamiliar with yard protocols. Where would be appropriate for walking?" The response again violated expected scripts. Razor anticipated either aggressive challenge or fearful submission. Marcus's polite inquiry, delivered without sarcasm or obvious fear, created momentary confusion. "You think you're funny?" Razor demanded, needing Marcus to provide clearer provocation justifying escalation. "I think I'm new," Marcus answered evenly. "I'd genuinely appreciate guidance regarding yard customs." Razor's associates exchanged uncertain glances. Their leader's authority required demonstrating dominance over this newcomer. Yet Marcus's complete absence of aggressive response made escalation feel somehow inappropriate, like attacking someone already surrendering, except Marcus wasn't actually surrendering. Carlos Rodriguez watched this interaction with growing interest from his position at the far corner. He didn't intervene, but his attention created subtle pressure on the developing situation. Razor noticed Carlos watching and recalculated his options. "Inner track is open," Razor finally stated, gesturing dismissively. "Stay off the outer perimeter." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you for clarifying." He altered his course without hurry, maintaining dignified composure while accommodating the territorial requirement. As Marcus moved away, Razor felt vaguely unsatisfied despite achieving his stated objective. Somehow this quiet newcomer had complied with demands while making Razor feel like the interaction had been educational courtesy rather than enforced submission. Tank observed this exchange with deepening frustration. Marcus was navigating Oak Ridge's dangerous social waters through strategies Tank didn't fully understand. The new inmate neither fought nor submitted, but somehow maintained dignity while avoiding confrontation. "What's his game?" Stretch wondered aloud, voicing Tank's own confusion. Tank didn't answer immediately. His 8 years of institutional dominance suddenly felt like potentially inadequate preparation for someone operating from completely different assumptions about power and respect. Carlos rose from his position and walked deliberately toward Marcus, who had resumed walking the inner track. Their conversation appeared casual to distant observers, but Carlos's protective proximity sent clear messages throughout the yard. Marcus Chen had attracted significant interest from Oak Ridge's most powerful independent authority. Wisdom under observation. Every action in confined environments communicates messages extending far beyond immediate circumstances. How did Marcus Chen's consistent responses to provocation begin reshaping Oak Ridge's social calculations? What makes strategic patience more powerful than reactive aggression? Discover how accumulated small choices create transformative shifts in how communities perceive strength itself. Evening descended over Oak Ridge with its familiar routine of head counts, lockdowns, and the peculiar quiet that settles over institutional spaces when movement becomes restricted. Marcus sat on his bunk, reading a worn paperback on Stoic philosophy that he'd borrowed from the prison library. His cellmate, a nervous young man named Tommy, serving 2 years for drug possession, watched Marcus with cautious curiosity. "You're different," Tommy observed hesitantly. "Most guys who come in either act hard immediately or get targeted. You're just calm." Marcus looked up from his book, offering slight acknowledgement. "Being calm doesn't mean lacking awareness. It means choosing response over reaction." Tommy considered this statement, his expression revealing the mental effort required to parse philosophical nuance. "Tank's gonna come after you harder. That's how he works. Tests new people until they either submit or fight. Then he knows where they fit." "Where do I fit if I neither submit nor fight?" Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than rhetorical. Tommy shook his head slowly. "I don't think there's a category for that here." Marcus smiled slightly. Then, perhaps we create one. 2 cells down, Tank listened to his own cellmate's analysis of Marcus Chen's disturbing pattern of responses. Bulls, a veteran inmate with 15 years accumulated wisdom, offered perspective that Tank found simultaneously enlightening and irritating. Kids playing a different game entirely, Bulls observed. You're thinking dominance hierarchy. He's thinking something else, maybe reputation through restraint, maybe building alliances through respect. Either way, standard intimidation ain't landing. Tank's jaw tightened. So what do you suggest? Bulls shrugged. You got 3 options. 1. Escalate to actual violence and establish dominance physically. 2. Leave him alone and risk appearing weak. 3. Find some accommodation that lets you both maintain status. Accommodation sounds like weakness, Tank muttered. Accommodation is weakness when you're afraid, Bulls corrected. It's strategy when you're strong enough to choose your battles. Meanwhile, in the guards' break room, Officer Patricia Henderson reviewed incident reports with her colleague, Officer Marcus Wright. Henderson had worked corrections for 12 years and developed sophisticated instincts regarding institutional dynamics. This new inmate, Chen, he's creating interesting ripples, Henderson observed. 3 separate confrontations in 2 weeks, 0 violence, and somehow everyone involved walks away uncertain about what happened. Wright nodded thoughtfully. Former Marine with martial arts background. Could probably handle himself physically, but chooses de-escalation consistently. That's actually more dangerous long-term than simple toughness. Henderson raised an eyebrow. How do you figure? Because it demonstrates discipline that most inmates haven't developed, Wright explained. That kind of self-control suggests capabilities they can't fully assess. Unknown capability creates caution. Caution creates space. Space creates safety. Henderson absorbed this analysis, recognizing its accuracy. You think he'll maintain this approach or eventually snap? That, Wright replied, depends entirely on whether the institutional environment allows him to succeed without compromising anyone hard enough. Discipline breaks. The observation contained wisdom earned through years witnessing how incarceration tested human resilience. Most inmates arrived with specific survival strategies: aggression, submission, affiliation, or isolation. Marcus Chen's approach defied these categories, which made him both fascinating and potentially volatile. Carlos Rodriguez, lying in his own cell after lights out, contemplated Marcus's presence and its implications. The young man possessed qualities that Carlos had rarely encountered during his 3 decades of incarceration: genuine discipline, philosophical grounding, and most remarkably, absence of ego driving his responses. These characteristics could either stabilize Oak Ridge's volatile social ecology or catalyze unexpected transformations. Carlos recognized that Marcus represented a test for the entire institution. Could a prison environment accommodate someone operating from principles rather than survival instincts? Or would the system inevitably force Marcus toward conventional categories of dominance or submission? The answer would determine more than one man's experience. It would reveal whether transformation remained possible within environments designed primarily for containment. The precipice. Tension accumulates gradually until single incidents carry weight far exceeding their immediate circumstances. What happens when institutional patience finally encounters calculated provocation? How do moments of crisis reveal character depths invisible during ordinary interactions? This chapter explores the crucible where disciplined restraint faces its ultimate test and discovers whether wisdom can truly transcend violence. The catalyst arrived during morning work detail in Oak Ridge's industrial laundry facility. Steam filled the concrete space, creating atmospheric obscurity that reduced guard visibility. Machines thundered with mechanical rhythm, their noise providing acoustic cover for conversations requiring privacy. Tank had planned this confrontation carefully, consulting with Bulls regarding strategic approach. His reputation demanded response to Marcus's pattern of non-compliance with institutional hierarchy. Yet simple violence risked creating martyr sympathy, or worse, revealing that Tank couldn't dominate the quiet newcomer even through direct assault. The solution involved manufactured provocation that would appear as Marcus's fault. If the new inmate could be pushed into throwing the first punch, Tank's response would carry institutional legitimacy. self-defense rather than bullying. Marcus operated an industrial pressing machine, maintaining steady workflow while remaining environmentally aware despite limited visibility. He noticed Tank's approach, flanked by Stretch and another associate called Brick. The positioning suggested coordination rather than coincidence. "Chen," Tank called out, his voice barely audible above machinery noise. "We need to settle something." Marcus looked up calmly, his hands continuing their work rhythm, while his attention focused completely on Tank. "What needs settling?" Tank moved closer, entering Marcus's personal space with clear aggressive intent. "You've been disrespecting me since you arrived, making me look soft in front of the whole population." Marcus maintained neutral expression, though his breathing shifted to a deeper, more controlled pattern, preparing for potential physical confrontation while remaining outwardly calm. "I've treated you with consistent respect. I've avoided conflict deliberately." "That's the problem," Tank countered, his voice rising slightly. "Your avoidance makes me look weak, like I can't command respect. That ends now." Stretch and Brick positioned themselves to block guard sightlines, creating temporary privacy. Other inmates working nearby subtly relocated to safer distances, recognizing violence's imminence. Marcus set down the material he'd been pressing, straightening to face Tank directly. His posture remained relaxed but centered, weight distributed evenly, hands open and visible. Anyone trained in martial awareness would recognize defensive readiness disguised as casual stance. "What outcome are you seeking?" Marcus asked quietly. "I genuinely want to understand what would satisfy your concerns." The question again disrupted Tank's prepared script. He'd anticipated defensive arguing or aggressive posturing, responses that would justify escalation. Marcus's calm inquiry about desired outcomes forced Tank to articulate objectives beyond simple dominance. "I want you to acknowledge my position here," Tank said, somewhat uncertain now about his own goals. "You don't get to just ignore how things work." "I've never ignored how things work," Marcus replied evenly. "I've simply chosen to respond without aggression. That's not disrespect toward you. It's respect toward myself." Tank's frustration mounted. Every interaction with Marcus created this same disorienting pattern. Philosophical responses to straightforward dominance plays. His hand shot forward, gripping Marcus's shirt, preparing to escalate into physical confrontation. Marcus didn't resist the grip or strike back. Instead, he looked directly into Tank's eyes with expression combining compassion and absolute fearlessness. "You're stronger than this," Marcus said softly. "You know violence here only creates cycles without ending." For a suspended moment, Tank's internal conflict became visible. His reputation demanded he follow through. Yet something in Marcus's absolute calm, his complete absence of fear or aggression, created profound hesitation. Then Carlos Rodriguez appeared from behind a bank of industrial dryers, his presence altering the encounter's entire dynamic. He didn't speak or gesture, simply stood watching, his authority sufficient to create invisible pressure. Tank released Marcus's shirt slowly, recognizing that escalating under Carlos's observation carried risks exceeding potential benefits. "This isn't finished," Tank stated, stepping back while maintaining face before his associates. Marcus nodded slightly. "I understand. When you want to actually talk rather than posture, I'm available." The comment carried no mockery, no victory declaration, simply genuine openness to future dialogue. Tank turned and walked away, Stretch and Brick following uncertainly. Carlos approached Marcus once the tension dissipated. "You handled that well, but you understand Tank can't let this pattern continue indefinitely." "I understand," Marcus confirmed. "What would you recommend?" "Give him a path to respect you without losing face," Carlos advised. "Right now you're creating a binary where he either dominates or appears weak. Find the third option." Marcus absorbed this wisdom thoughtfully. Unexpected alliance. True resolution emerges not through victory or defeat, but through mutual recognition of shared humanity. How could Marcus transform Tank's antagonism into something approaching understanding? What conversation might bridge the gap between dominance and dignity? Witness how vulnerability and honesty create pathways impossible through force alone. Marcus requested a meeting with Tank through Carlos Rodriguez, who served as intermediary. The request itself demonstrated strategic wisdom. Approaching through established authority showed respect for institutional protocols while creating space for genuine dialogue. Tank's initial response was predictably skeptical. What's he want? To apologize? To submit formally? Carlos shook his head slightly. He wants to talk, actually talk, not posture or negotiate dominance. I told him you'd consider it. Why would I give him that? Tank demanded. Because, Carlos replied carefully, continuing this path leads nowhere good for either of you. He's not backing down. You can't afford to appear unable to handle one new inmate. Eventually something escalates beyond control. Or you could try something different. Tank considered this analysis, recognizing Carlos wouldn't involve himself without seeing potential value. When? Tonight, rec room, after dinner. I'll be present to ensure neither of you misinterprets the other's intentions. The meeting occurred in a corner of the recreation room where several tables provided relative privacy. Carlos sat between them initially, his presence conferring legitimacy on the conversation while preventing misunderstandings from escalating. Tank arrived first, his body language defensive despite outward confidence. Marcus appeared shortly after, carrying 2 cups of coffee that he'd acquired through commissary connections. He placed one before Tank without comment, a small gesture of goodwill establishing conversational tone. Thanks, Tank said cautiously, uncertain about appropriate response to this courtesy. Marcus sat down, meeting Tank's gaze directly. I want to explain something that I don't think I've communicated clearly. My behavior isn't about you. It's about who I need to be to survive in here without losing myself. Tank's expression revealed skepticism, but he remained silent, allowing Marcus to continue. Before prison, I spent 12 years in the Marines. Marcus continued. 3 combat deployments. I learned that violence is easy, discipline is hard, control is everything. He paused, choosing words carefully. I killed someone defending my sister. Court said I went too far, used excessive force. They might be right. I'll never know for certain if I could have stopped him without lethal response. This vulnerability represented significant risk. Admitting uncertainty about justified violence could suggest weakness, yet Marcus's tone carried such genuine self-examination that it transcended simple confession. That uncertainty haunts me, Marcus said quietly. So I made a promise to myself. In here, I would never use force unless absolutely no alternative existed. Not because I fear you or anyone else, because I fear who I become when violence feels justified. Tank absorbed this explanation, his defensive posture gradually relaxing. You think I don't understand that? I've been here 8 years. You think I wanted to become the guy everyone fears? This place makes you into whatever survives. Does it? Marcus asked gently. Or do we choose what we become, even in circumstances that pressure us toward specific roles? The question hung between them. Philosophical yet intensely practical, Carlos observed the exchange with satisfaction. This conversation represented exactly the third option he'd suggested Marcus find. Your reputation matters, Marcus continued. I understand that institutional survival requires positioning, but your reputation doesn't require my submission. It requires my respect, and I do respect you, your intelligence, your strategic thinking, your ability to maintain position without constant violence. That's harder than simple dominance. Tank found himself disarmed by this unexpected validation. Marcus wasn't surrendering or challenging. He was offering genuine acknowledgement of capabilities that Tank rarely received recognition for, beyond crude fear. So what are you suggesting? Tank asked, his tone shifting from defensive to curious. I'm suggesting we both acknowledge reality, Marcus replied. You're powerful here. I'm not challenging that. I'm simply asking for space to exist without compromising my principles. In return, I'll support your position when appropriate, defer to your judgment on institutional matters I don't understand, and never undermine your authority publicly. Carlos leaned forward slightly. That's called mutual respect. Novel concept in here, but it works. Tank considered the proposal carefully. His pride resisted accepting any arrangement that might appear like negotiation rather than dominance. Yet Bulls's earlier observation echoed in his mind. Accommodation from strength is strategy, not weakness. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours, Tank proposed. But if situations require it, you defer to my judgment on yard politics. Agreed, Marcus confirmed. With one caveat. If your judgment requires I compromise my core principles, we discuss alternatives privately first. Tank extended his hand across the table. Marcus shook it firmly, sealing an arrangement that redefined possibility within Oak Ridge's rigid social structures. Transformation ripples. Single relationships can catalyze systemic shifts in how entire communities understand power and respect. How did Marcus and Tank's unexpected accord reshape Oak Ridge's social dynamics? What possibilities emerge when former adversaries model cooperation over conflict? Explore how individual transformation inspires collective evolution. Lessons transcending any particular environment. Word of Marcus and Tank's arrangement spread through Oak Ridge's informal communication networks with characteristic speed. Inmates observed their subsequent interactions carefully, searching for signs of submission or weakness that might reveal exploitable vulnerabilities in either man's position. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented: mutual respect between individuals who might typically compete for dominance. Tank continued exercising considerable authority over his established sphere of influence. Marcus maintained his disciplined independence while deferring to Tank regarding territorial and social protocols Marcus genuinely didn't understand. The arrangement's most profound impact manifested in how other inmates began reconsidering their own relationships and survival strategies. If someone as powerful as Tank could accommodate someone as principled as Marcus, perhaps rigid dominance hierarchies weren't inevitable. Tommy, Marcus's cellmate, articulated this shift during evening conversation. Things feel different lately, like there's less tension everywhere. People are actually talking instead of just posturing all the time. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Fear creates cycles. Respect creates space. When powerful people choose respect, permission spreads for others to try different approaches. This observation proved prophetic. 3 separate conflicts that would typically escalate into violence instead resolved through conversation during the following weeks. Inmates began requesting Carlos or occasionally Tank to mediate disputes rather than defaulting to physical confrontation. Officer Henderson noticed the change during her rounds. The temperatures dropped in here, she mentioned to Officer Wright. Fewer incidents, less ambient aggression. Something shifted. Wright had been observing Marcus's influence carefully. Chen's modeling something different, and Tank's support legitimizes it. You get those two dynamics together, you create possibility for cultural change. Think it'll last? Henderson asked skeptically. Prisons rarely sustained positive transformations. New arrivals or administrative changes typically disrupted fragile equilibriums. Depends, Wright replied. If enough people internalize the approach before something destabilizes it, maybe. Change needs time to root. Meanwhile, Marcus began informal teaching sessions in the recreation room, sharing martial philosophy and meditation techniques with interested inmates. He didn't advertise these sessions or recruit participants. Word simply spread that Marcus offered practical wisdom about managing stress, anger, and the psychological challenges of incarceration. Tank surprised many observers by attending occasionally, sitting in the back and listening without comment. His presence conferred legitimacy that attracted inmates who might otherwise dismiss philosophical discussion as weakness. During one session, a young inmate named Devin asked Marcus about fear management. How do you stay calm when someone's threatening you? Aren't you afraid? Marcus considered the question carefully. Fear is information, not instruction. When someone threatens me, I feel fear. It alerts me to danger. But I don't let fear dictate my response. I acknowledge the feeling, then choose action based on principles rather than reaction. That sounds impossible, Devin protested. Fear makes you react automatically. Fear invites automatic reaction, Marcus corrected gently. But between stimulus and response, their space training expands that space. Practice turns conscious choice into reliable habit. Eventually, disciplined response becomes as automatic as fear-driven reaction used to be. Tank spoke up unexpectedly from his position in the back. He's right. I spent years reacting with aggression because fear told me anything else meant weakness. But aggression just creates more fear, more cycles. Chen's way is harder, but it actually resolves things. The endorsement from Tank carried enormous weight. Other inmates began considering whether they might develop similar capabilities, not through dramatic transformation, but through consistent small choices accumulating over time. Carlos observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. He'd spent 30 years in institutional environments and rarely witnessed cultural evolution. This organic or promising Marcus hadn't arrived claiming superior wisdom or demanding followers. He'd simply modeled different possibilities consistently enough that others began imagining alternatives to their own established patterns. Yet Carlos remained cautiously aware that all positive momentum remained vulnerable to disruption. New inmates arrived weekly, bringing external aggression. Administrative policies changed unpredictably. Individual circumstances evolved in ways that might trigger regression to familiar survival strategies. The question wasn't whether Marcus had created temporary improvement. That was evident. The question was whether this emerging culture could sustain itself beyond any individual's influence, becoming genuinely institutional rather than dependent on specific personalities. That answer would require time, testing, and continued commitment from enough participants to reach critical mass where cooperation became normative rather than exceptional. The journey had begun promisingly. Its continuation depended on countless individual choices yet to come. Testing grounds. Every emerging culture faces challenges that test whether new patterns can withstand pressure from old instincts. What happens when external forces threaten fragile transformation? How do communities discover whether changed behavior reflects genuine evolution or merely temporary accommodation? This chapter examines how crisis reveals the depth of transformation and the resilience of wisdom under assault. The test arrived with Raymond Reaper Jackson's transfer from maximum security. Reaper had accumulated 23 years of incarceration across multiple facilities, his reputation preceding him like an atmospheric pressure system, announcing approaching storms. He'd requested transfer to Oak Ridge specifically because he'd heard the institution had grown soft, an intolerable condition requiring correction. Reaper arrived during morning intake, his heavily scarred frame and dead-eyed expression communicating pure predatory calculation. Guards processed his paperwork with extra vigilance, aware that his file documented extensive violence across 2 decades of institutional misconduct. Marcus first saw Reaper during cafeteria lunch, recognizing immediately that this new arrival represented fundamental challenge to Oak Ridge's recent cultural evolution. Reaper's body language broadcast clear intention, re-established traditional dominance hierarchies through whatever force necessary. Tank noticed Reaper simultaneously, his expression darkening. "This is trouble," Tank muttered to Stretch. "Reaper doesn't do accommodation or respect. He only understands power demonstrated through violence." Carlos approached Marcus and Tank's adjacent tables shortly after Reaper's entrance. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "All 3 of us. Privately. Immediately." They convened in the library's isolated corner, where Carlos outlined the situation with characteristic directness. Reaper will test everyone's positioning. He'll start with whoever appears most vulnerable, establish dominance, then systematically challenge every authority structure until he controls the yard. "So we establish that he can't control us," Tank suggested, his tone revealing eagerness for confrontation. "Violence plays to his strengths," Carlos countered. "Reaper survived 2 decades through brutal consistency. Physical confrontation rewards his approach and undermines everything we've built here recently." Marcus listened intently, processing tactical options. "What's his actual goal? Beyond violence itself, what does he want?" Carlos considered the question. Status. Fear-based respect. Control over his immediate environment. Same things most long-term inmates want, just pursued through particularly destructive methods. "Then we give him those things," Marcus proposed, "through channels that don't require violence or undermine our emerging culture." Tank looked skeptical. "You can't give Reaper status through peaceful respect. That's not his language." "Maybe we teach him a new language," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "What if we offer him genuine respect for legitimate capabilities while establishing clear boundaries about acceptable behavior?" "He'll interpret boundaries as challenges," Carlos observed, "then violate them to establish dominance. Marcus nodded slowly. Unless we make violating boundaries appear weak rather than strong. What if the entire population, led by you two as established authorities, responds to violence not with fear or counter-violence but with disappointment? Social disapproval from people whose respect actually matters. Tank struggled to envision this approach succeeding against someone like Reaper. You're suggesting we shame him into cooperation? I'm suggesting we create an environment where violence fails to achieve his actual goals, Marcus clarified. Status requires recognition from others. If violent behavior earns contempt from people whose opinions matter institutionally, it becomes counterproductive. Carlos's expression revealed dawning understanding. We'd need complete consistency. Everyone responds to violence identically. Withdrawal of social engagement, visible disappointment, treatment as childish rather than frightening. Can we achieve that level of coordination? Tank asked doubtfully. Only one way to know, Carlos replied. They spent the afternoon discreetly communicating with key influencers throughout Oak Ridge's various social networks. The proposal was unprecedented. Collectively refused to reward violence with fear or counter-violence. Instead, treat aggressive behavior as embarrassing social failure deserving pity rather than respect. Most inmates expressed skepticism, but agreed to attempt the approach, primarily because Carlos, Tank, and Marcus presented unified leadership. If those three supported this strategy, perhaps it merited trial. Reaper made his move during evening recreation. He selected a victim with typical predator calculation, someone appearing vulnerable but connected enough that dominating him would send broader messages. His target, Devin, the young inmate who'd been attending Marcus's philosophy sessions. Reaper approached Devin with theatrical menace, shoving him hard enough to send the younger man stumbling. "This yard's got rules, kid. You want to walk here, you pay tribute." Devin looked frightened, but didn't respond with either aggression or immediate submission. Instead, he looked toward Marcus, who remained seated at a nearby table. Marcus stood slowly, approaching with completely calm demeanor. Around the yard, other inmates subtly shifted attention toward the developing confrontation, while maintaining apparent disinterest. "Reaper," Marcus said evenly, reaching Devin's side. "I'm Marcus Chen. Welcome to Oak Ridge. Is there something Devin can help you with?" Reaper's eyes narrowed, assessing this interference. "This doesn't concern you, Chen. Walk away before you get included in his lesson." Marcus smiled slightly, his expression genuinely friendly rather than mocking. "I appreciate the warning, but Devin's been attending discussion sessions I facilitate, so his well-being does concern me. Perhaps we could talk about whatever issue needs addressing." "There's no issue to discuss," Reaper growled, stepping toward Marcus with clear aggressive intent. "There's just hierarchy to establish." And then something remarkable occurred. Throughout the recreation yard, inmates turned deliberately away from the confrontation, not fleeing in fear, simply withdrawing attention as if Reaper's behavior was too embarrassing to witness. Tank made a point of shaking his head sadly before turning back to his weightlifting. Carlos closed his book with obvious disappointment before walking toward the building entrance. Within seconds, Reaper found himself performing dominance theater to an audience that had collectively decided not to watch The Unexpected Legacy. Every journey toward transformation reveals unexpected destinations beyond original intentions. What emerged from Oak Ridge's collective experiment in reimagining institutional culture? How did individual discipline catalyze community evolution that transcended any single person's vision? Discover how wisdom, courage, and persistent commitment create legacies that outlast their origins. Reaper stood in the recreation yard, his aggressive posture suddenly appearing theatrical, without an audience validating its significance. Inmates throughout the space had turned deliberately away, their collective disinterest communicating clearer rejection than any confrontation could have achieved. Marcus remained present, his expression calm and vaguely sympathetic. "This must feel disorienting," Marcus observed quietly. "You arrived expecting traditional dynamics, but things work differently here now." Reaper's confusion manifested as anger, familiar ground when uncertainty threatened. "You think ignoring me makes you tough? I'll show every person here what happens when—" "When what?" Marcus interrupted gently. "When you use violence to force fear. That approach worked in other institutions. Here, It earns disappointment rather than respect. You're welcome to try it, but you'll discover that dominance without recognition is just lonely aggression. Tank approached from behind, his considerable presence adding weight to Marcus's words. Chen's right. You can fight whoever you want, beat whoever you want, but you'll find that violence here doesn't buy what you're actually seeking. We've built something different. You can join it or remain isolated, your choice. Reaper looked between Marcus and Tank, recognizing that these two represented unlikely alliance between newcomer philosophy and established institutional power. Their unified position suggested this wasn't temporary experiment but genuine cultural shift. What exactly have you built? Reaper asked, his tone cautious now rather than aggressive. Carlos rejoined the conversation, completing the leadership triangle. Community based on mutual respect rather than fear-driven hierarchy. Strength demonstrated through discipline rather than violence. Status earned through contribution rather than intimidation. Reaper laughed harshly. That's not how prison works. It's not how prison has worked, Carlos corrected. But systems change when enough participants choose different patterns. You can be part of that evolution, or remain stuck in outdated approaches. Either way, Oak Ridge isn't returning to fear-based dominance. The confrontation dissolved without violence or clear resolution. Reaper retreated to process this unexpected reality. Devon thanked Marcus quietly before returning to his activities. The yard's ambient tension eased as inmates recognized that the newcomers' traditional approach had failed to destabilize their emerging culture. Over subsequent weeks, Reaper tested boundaries repeatedly, each time discovering that violence earned social isolation rather than fear-based respect. Gradually, grudgingly, he began attending Marcus's discussion sessions. Initially, his participation consisted mainly of skeptical challenges, but eventually genuine questions emerged. How do you actually manage anger? Reaper asked during one session, his tone suggesting authentic curiosity rather than confrontational testing. 23 years I've used anger as fuel. What replaces it? Marcus considered the question respectfully. Anger doesn't need replacing. It needs understanding. Anger communicates that boundaries have been violated or values threatened. The emotion itself isn't problematic. Reactive expression without conscious choice. That creates cycles of escalation. What if you felt anger, acknowledged its message, then chose response based on your actual goals rather than immediate reaction? Reaper absorbed this perspective slowly. Goals beyond survival? Survival is baseline, Marcus acknowledged. But humans need purpose beyond mere existence. What do you want your remaining time in here to accomplish? Who do you want to become? Those questions matter more than daily dominance maintenance. The conversation represented breakthrough moment. Reaper began engaging with philosophical inquiry seriously, his considerable intelligence finally directed toward growth rather than destruction. Months passed. Oak Ridge's transformation deepened gradually, incorporating each new arrival into cultural expectations that valued cooperation over conflict. Guards noticed sustained reduction in violent incidents. Administrative reviews documented improved institutional climate. Most importantly, inmates themselves reported experiencing incarceration differently. Still difficult, still constraining, but somehow more humane. Marcus achieved parole eligibility after 5 years of exemplary institutional behavior. His departure created anxiety among inmates who'd come to rely on his guidance and modeling, but the culture he'd helped catalyze had rooted deeply enough to survive his absence. Tank assumed primary responsibility for maintaining philosophical discussion sessions, his own transformation from feared enforcer to respected mentor, inspiring newer inmates seeking different paths. Carlos continued providing wise oversight, his authority now supplemented by genuine community rather than simply fear-based respect. Reaper, remarkably, became one of the program's most committed advocates, his journey from violent predator to contemplative participant demonstrating transformation's possibility, even for those most deeply entrenched in destructive patterns. Officer Henderson reflected on these changes during staff meeting presentation about Oak Ridge's cultural evolution. What Marcus Chen demonstrated was simple but profound. Discipline modeled consistently creates permission for others to try different approaches. Tank Morrison's willingness to support that modeling legitimized it institutionally. Together they proved that even prison environments can evolve beyond pure survival-based hierarchies. Marcus Chen walked free on a spring morning, carrying minimal possessions but profound wisdom earned through his years navigating Oak Ridge's challenging environment. His sister waited outside the gates, her gratitude for his sacrifice evident in her tearful embrace. "Was it worth it?" she asked softly. "All those years, the sacrifice?" Marcus considered the question thoughtfully, watching the prison facility recede as they drove away. "I discovered that circumstances don't determine character, they reveal it. Prison showed me capabilities I didn't know I possessed. Not physical strength or dominance, but capacity for sustained discipline, patience under pressure, and contribution to community, even in the most unlikely environments." He paused, reflecting on faces he'd left behind. Tank, Carlos, Reaper, Devin, Tommy, and dozens of others whose lives had intersected with his during those transformative years. "I entered prison having killed someone, uncertain whether I could control my own capacity for violence. I'm leaving having discovered that true strength emerges not through dominance, but through disciplined presence, authentic respect, and willingness to model different possibilities." The road ahead stretched toward uncertain future, but Marcus Chen traveled it with profound understanding. Transformation begins with individual choice, spreads through consistent example, and becomes sustainable only when communities embrace evolution collectively. His legacy remained at Oak Ridge, woven into cultural fabric that would continue shaping lives long after his departure. The prison bully had hit the wrong inmate, not because Marcus possessed superior fighting capability, but because he carried wisdom that violence could never defeat. The understanding that true power emerges when strength serves wisdom rather than dominance, and that lesson, once learned and genuinely internalized, changes everything. Thank you for joining this journey through Marcus Chen's transformation and the unexpected community evolution it inspired. If these themes of disciplined resilience, strategic wisdom, and human potential resonated with you, consider subscribing for more stories exploring how individual character shapes collective possibility, even in the most challenging environments.